Hi guys, welcome back to Swordwind. We are the Charlotte branch of the New York Historical Fencing Association. My name is Eric Lowe, and in this video we're going to be discussing the guard of Ox. Ox is one of the primary defensive guards in the KDF tradition. Definitionally speaking, the Ox is any guard where the hands are above the natural waist and the point is presented forward. We're going to talk about in this video kind of variations of that ox and what we prefer as the prototypical ox to kind of help beginners internalize what this guard is good for and what it's not. To begin with, here on my dominant side, just to give a look at what the guard looks like. Couple of things to note about this. One is that my hands are outside my silhouette. I'm not doing this, but out here. The reason for this is because I want to intercept a blow coming at my head or my upper openings before it reaches anywhere near my body. So I want this pushed out nice into the side. I also want it you'll notice I'm holding my ox with my arms extended. The reason for that is because I want to resist any sort of incoming force with my skeletal structure. I've got this nice kind of prototypical martial arts triangle here, and not just with my arms. When it comes to kind of resisting sudden impulses, I am not a particularly strong individual, but even people who are need to be able to engage their muscles to resist a sword strike. And frankly, sword fights happen fast enough that you don't necessarily have time to kind of push back with your muscles, even if you had the muscular strength to successfully oppose a blow. You'll also notice that I'm holding this at about the level of my head, but not over my head. There's a lot of variations of ox that I think are worth practicing, but for this kind of most prototypical beginner's ox, you'll notice that's not necessary. The reason for that is because if I push this out far enough, then a blade is going to intersect my blade or my cross guard long before the part that stretches up over my blade can reach my head. So at about the level of your eyes is, I think, a good level to practice holding ox. Now, part of that is dependent on your height relative to the average height of your opponents. If you are very short, then you should probably practice holding ox higher up. If you are very, very tall, then you might not need to practice holding ox at the level of your eyes, maybe kind of closer to the level of your chin. I'm going to set this down since this is a guard that is difficult to hold for, at least in a static position, for too long. The next thing I want to talk about with ox is your wrist position. You'll notice, if I go back into guard again, both of my wrists are nice and naturally kind of straight in line with my forearm. I am not curling over either wrist, and I am not over-pronating this wrist by trying to keep my forearm in line with the handle. There should be, for the dominant hand, you can basically punch up kind of into your upper openings, open your hand, and put a sword in it. That is the angle of the wrist that you want to do. Same thing with your bottom hand, punch up, open your hand, put a sword in it. Now, this is the first guard that we've talked about on this channel where your hands do not have that kind of default cutting grip that we have talked so much about. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that any kind of cut you can throw from here that would benefit from that grip gives you time to transition into it as you present your edge to the opponent. So there is plenty of time to transition that grip into something that is more functional for cutting. Another reason, you'll notice that my thumb is supporting the blade to help make this a little on the flat, like this. That does a couple of things. In terms of kind of defense, it helps me support the blade. It also makes this guard slightly less tiring to hold. In terms of offense, pointing my thumb allows me to kind of just jab my thumb into somebody's eye, and the point will follow it. And lastly, the thumb of all of your fingers is the one that you can least afford to lose in a sword fight. Not that it's good to lose any finger, but if you must lose one, it should be something other than your thumb. This puts the thumb nicely behind a solid wall of steel. This, with my thumb above, puts my thumb uncomfortably close to the crossguard, and a blade could hit my crossguard, and although it wouldn't be able to hit my head, could split my thumb open. That could be enough to end the fight right there, because if I can't hold a sword anymore with this hand. Now, for all of those reasons, I'm going to get a little closer to the camera. You're essentially cradling the sword in your hand here, and this heel of the palm contact is not there for the backhand. For the bottom hand, it is. I am, let's see, here. While my top hand looks like this, my bottom hand has that heel of the palm contact. I curl my arms, I curl my fingers around the sword, and here we go. There's a couple of reasons for that. The main one is that I want that edge alignment for anything that I might. I want that edge alignment for anything that I might do here. Let me take that back. That is not the main one. It is a relevant thing. It is a relevant one. I want to kind of have this wrist behind the edge whenever possible. That's not possible for my bottom hand unless I'm doing this, which puts my thumb unnecessarily at risk and doesn't really help line up the thrust as well as this does. The other reason is that it keeps the wrist nice and natural, as opposed to something like this or this, where I have to bend my wrist more. I want, as part of that kind of defensive structure, I want my wrists to be as lined up with my forearms as possible, not bent so that that's a stress point if somebody hits my guard. Speaking of that structure, you'll notice that because I can, and because I am interested in forming a nice solid defensive structure, although my head is pointed at my opponent and my point is kind of angled in at my opponent, my center line is lined up with this point between my hands, just as it would be if I had finished a cut. And in fact, this is one of the ways, of course, that you can get into Ochs. For those of you who know a little bit more about KDF, Ochs is one of the guards that arises naturally as the termination of several cuts. Speaking of that, in this kind of prototypical Ochs, I have my cross guard nice and horizontal, parallel to the ground. The reason for that is because my cross guard is only so long, and I want to get the maximum amount of horizontal coverage out of it. I'm holding my cross guard fairly, I'm holding the blade parallel to the ground as opposed to dipping down, because the more I dip down, the more I present my fingers to an incoming cut. If I wanted to be really safe, I could point up. This protects my fingers very well, but it doesn't threaten the opponent. If my handle allows it, I can back my fingers off a little bit. I hope you can see that here, so that even with a straight parallel to the ground ox, a blade is not likely to nick my fingers. However, let's get into kind of variations on ox now before we move. The blade angle that you get into ox, and therefore the crossguard angle, changes depending on how you have gotten into it. If I'm throwing an Unterhau like this, then my blade and my guard are going to be at about 45 degrees. And maybe if I decide to stay in ox, I will then flip over into something that's a little safer for my fingers. But because ox is one of the guards that you can get into from cutting, we should not think of kind of needing to end in that prototypical ox at the exact end of every cut. I should not, for instance, be throwing my Unterhau like this. This is only going to slap the opponent with the flat here, and then I'm not even going to get here because my sword is going to stop at his hip. On the other hand, if I'm throwing this Wehrhau, then I may end up in this sort of prototypical beginner's ox if I am throwing this Wehrhau to the ox. If I'm throwing this Wehrhau to the plow, then I won't. In fact, I might end up, because I'm cutting to somebody's lower openings here, I might end up with my fingers presented to the opponent, as I was just saying not to do. And that is fine as long as I am doing that because I am cutting, and then I can flip up into something that's safer for my fingers. The last kind of, I think, important point to note about variations on ox that are worth holding or practicing is that you will oftentimes see ox, even in manuals, with the arms bent. There are two kind of practical reasons for this. One is that it is less tiring to hold than out here. I don't think there's a problem if you want to fight from this position. It does kind of cramp the wrist a little bit, but you have your arms better engaged. You have your arm muscles better engaged to kind of support the sword comfortably. And when you push out, you can straighten that wrist. The push out is important because, again, you don't want to, even if you kind of hang out here, you don't want to intercept a blade here. When you are parrying an ox, arms extended, nice strong structure that is important. So you can hold ox in this kind of more comfortable position and then push out into a parry. That's fine. What you don't want to do is hold ox here and just hold ox here while somebody smashes your sword. And if they're cutting for real, they'll probably smash your crossguard straight into your forehead, which may not kill you, but is going to degrade your ability to fight for certainly the next several seconds, which is probably all your opponent will need. The other kind of tactical thing I want to point out about extended versus sort of retreated ox is where it places the different parts of your sword. In KDF, we divide the sword very simply into the strong, which is the crossguard half of the blade, and the weak. Different sword arts divide the sword into 3, 4, 12 different segments, but the mechanical principles are always the same, that somebody striking your blade further away from the crossguard is able to get more movement for a given amount of force. This is because we, of course, hold our swords back here, so this kind of closest to our fist is where it is hardest to manipulate the sword. Now, if I am holding my ox back here close to my head, I am retreating the part of my sword which can best oppose an opponent's blade. And I am kind of moving the dangerous part of my sword, the weak, closer to my head. With this kind of ox, it is much easier for somebody to just strike right about here and blast my sword out of the way and strike my head, because I have moved the most defensive part of my sword away from the opponent and sort of presented to him the easily manipulatable part at a distance which is close enough to my head that he can take advantage of that. Out here, somebody can still, of course, strike the easily manipulatable weak of my blade, but it will happen way the heck out there away from my head. So even if my sword is knocked out of the way, the cut will not reach me. Similarly, if he wants to strike my sword at a distance where he could knock the sword out of the way and strike my head, he has to do that on the strong, because that is the part that I have shoved into that kind of danger zone. So I am much better able to resist that. Sword hits the blade, maybe jars a little bit, but does not allow the cut to blow through my head. So on the left side, that is about what we have to say for Oxes that I think are not necessarily kind of the prototypical Ox that I teach beginners. I want people to internalize parrying with extended arms, and with the cross guard as defensive, covering as much defensive real estate as possible. But there are, for this guard, a lot of other, I think, very useful variations, such as the ones we've just discussed. Now let's talk about ways that the guard can go wrong. And by wrong, again, I don't mean that it's not Ox, because this is Ox, this is Ox, this is Ox, this, in my opinion, is Ox, although it's very weird. Hands above the waist, point forward. This is Ox, this is Ox. Right, all of these things are Ox. That doesn't mean all of them are equally useful. One that I personally think is very dangerous is this kind of cross-guard horizontal Ox. Now this does present steel between the opponent and my head, so it certainly has that advantage. It also allows me to keep my basic cutting grip so that I don't have to do a lot of hand adjustment if I decide to cut from here. The problem that it has is that it doesn't defend my knuckles. And although the knuckles are not exactly a vital organ, without them it is very difficult to fight. We know from archaeological records, as well as just kind of collating things in the manuals, that a person's right forearm and hand tended to suffer the most damage, or tended to suffer damage the most often in fights in the Middle Ages. So this, although it does certainly have virtues, and I can understand why people sometimes advocate for it, makes me very uncomfortable from a knuckle position. I want, personally speaking, and let me emphasize that this really is personal preference. I think that this is a historically defensible position. It makes me uncomfortable because I want my cross guard in front of my protecting my fingers. Other ways you can see Ox go wrong that I think are somewhat less defensible are having the forearm in line with the handle and the blade. If your pommel ever is digging into your bottom forearm, as it is here, then you should adjust that hand. Right? The problem here is not so much that this is uncomfortable, although it is. It's that my bottom arm is not presenting as strong a defensive structure as it is if my forearm is not in line with the pommel, with the blade. Similarly, sometimes you'll see people kind of over twist one or more wrists. That's a problem, again, for defensive structure purposes, as well as most of the time being not particularly comfortable. The other kind of problems I tend to see with Ox come with just not having extended arms, right? This is a comfortable Ox, and again, as I said, if you want to fight from here, that's fine, as long as you don't parry here. If you want to fight from here, go ahead. When you are parrying with this guard, push it out so that you have a nice, strong structure intercepting the opponent's blade. So now let us talk about Ox on the right side. Here we have crossed arms. You'll see my wrists are crossed. Guard looks like this. The crossed wrists is something that may be sort of, if not unique, it's probably not unique to KDF, but it is certainly sort of distinctive, at least as opposed to the Italian tradition that Fiore di Libere represents. Fiore has a pronounced preference not to cross the wrists. That's not to say that he never does it, or was kind of unaware that human bodies move this way, just that he had his own philosophical reasons for avoiding this. And if this feels awkward to you, especially kind of the first times that you try it, then you can easily understand why a fencing teacher might advise his students not to do this whenever possible. There is no getting around the fact that crossed hand guards are more awkward to hold than open hand guards, particularly if you have any kind of forearm protection, as you might if you were fighting in armor, or in a modern context, as you might, well, first off, when fighting in armor, or when fighting in kind of modern HEMA unarmored protective gear. Once your wrists get kind of larded up, you start having to do this, and that makes it even more awkward. Nevertheless, Lichtenauer doesn't shy away from the crossed hand guards, and so presumably his advice to those of us who say, you know, gee teacher, this feels kind of awkward, would be practice more. There are a couple of things you can do though to make this less awkward. The main one is that now that we have crossed hands, you can actually maintain this default cutting guard in Ox. If I get a little closer to the camera so you can see that, my top hand has that heel contact, and my bottom hand, I hope you can see this, does as well. One of the things that does, in the same way that when we're in long point or in Vomtag, I wanted to mention, we want to make sure that that knuckle is not digging into our wrist. If we maintain this grip in right or crossed hands Ox, then our hands fit together kind of like puzzle pieces. They don't get in each other's way. If you break that guard and twist one of the hands one way or the other, then your knuckles start getting in the way of the other hand. That makes the guard much less comfortable to hold, much less natural. You'll notice that my thumb is still underneath steel here, nice and protected, as well as helping me aim a thrust. That is a theme you will see in all of the kind of primary defensive guards in KDF. Keep the thumb behind steel. Wrists still nice and natural, as they would be in our default cutting guard, default cutting grip, I should say. Hands, and therefore hilt, still at about the level of the eyes. That's again assuming that I consider myself of average height compared to my opponents. Point pointed at the opponent. Center line in line with the point between my hands. And cross guard nice and horizontal to cover the maximum amount of defensive real estate. Now, all of the things that we said for crossed hands ox variations hold true. For open hands ox variations hold true on the crossed hand side as well. So I don't necessarily need to fight from here all the time. I could fight from here, which may be a little more comfortable because I'm not holding this weight so far from my body, but I parry out here. If I am reaching this guard from a cut, perhaps my cross guard will not be horizontal. When I decide to stay in that guard, at least for a moment, I flip over to horizontal. If I am cutting in a way that tilts my knuckles or my hands forward to the opponent, then I flip up to protect them when I have the opportunity. If my handle allows it, I might want to back my hands off a little bit so that they are not quite so jammed up on the cross guard and vulnerable to be cut. This is especially true in crossed hands ox if you can, because we are not now presenting just kind of the fingers to the opponent's blade potentially, but the whole meat of the hand. So not all longswords historically had the same amount of real estate on the handle. And in a modern context, I don't know how bulky your gloves are, but to the extent that you can, if you want to, you probably want to back this off, especially in crossed hands ox. The last thing I want to point out is transitioning between the left and right oxes. That's this is sort of a separate topic from the guards themselves, but let's bring it up here. The name for kind of transitioning between guards in KDF is winding, or winden if you prefer. Two things just that I want to point out about winding between oxes. One is that you want to keep your point pointed at the opponent as much as possible. To the extent that you can, you want your point to remain fixed in space while your hilt makes this kind of half-pipe cone to the other side of your head. The reason for that is because if your point ever comes offline, if you ever wind, for instance, like this, and then you kind of represent the point, while your point is offline in between, your opponent has an opening to move in safely and either cut or stab you, utilizing the principles of Nachreisen or Ansetzen, as they are referred to in KDF respectively. So how do you do that? Well, this is one of the times when kind of a slightly retreated ox comes in very handy. If I hold my ox way forward, it is very difficult, not impossible, but difficult, to get over to the other side with my point still pointed at my opponent. If my ox is slightly retreated, I don't need to hold it way back here by my head, but just a little bit bent. As I transition, I can push forward with my hands, and that gives them a little bit more play, a little bit more room to move without having to move the tip. So let me commend that to your practice. The last thing I want to, it occurs to me I didn't talk about, is here's one more way that ox can go wrong. We've talked about holding it outside the silhouette, so that means I'm not doing this. However, it equally means I don't want to be doing this, right? This moves the sword very far away from actually defending my head. The strongest part defensively of the sword is right around here, and I want that part to be thrust forward, not only so that I am threatening the enemy, but also so that it is in line with the path that a sword struck from my opponent's right towards my head would take. If I am holding my ox like this, yes, my arms are extended. I can even twist myself so that my center line is lined up with the point between my hands, And now I have a nice defensive structure pointed over there. If I am, for some reason, defending against a cut way over there, then I suppose this is a fine guard. But if I am fighting somebody in front of me, as I should always strive to be doing, then the cut is coming this way, not this way. And so I want my the strongest part of my sword here. So remember that when you are, especially when you are in right ox, because anytime your hands, your body is doing something slightly uncomfortable, it is easy to overlook some of the functional fundamentals. Remember that you want to think about the path that your opponent's sword is most likely to take towards your head, and you want to put the strong of your sword with extended arms in the path, or with arms that are able to extend into this position, in the path of that cut. I hope this has been useful for you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will see you next week with another guard.